An aged black and white photograph of the house had been politely included inside the envelope, along with the neatly folded legal documents from the law offices of Alfred Meyer, Esquire. My first assumption was that I was being properly notified of some sort of legal action against either myself or my wife Rachel. Thankfully, neither she nor I were in the initial process of being sued. Instead, I was being informed of an inheritance in which I was unknowingly included in by my late Uncle Vernon Balzer.
I wasn't even aware you had an Uncle Vernon, dear,
said Rachel, as she cleared the table from this evening's meal of lamb and potatoes. He was what you might refer to as the black sheep of the family. Out of my father's 4 brothers, he was the one who rarely attended any family functions, I answered, not looking up from the letter.
Well, he was apparently very fond of you if you willed his home to you,
she replied, as she stepped back into the dining room. Yes, it would seem that way. I peered over the documents at her. They've included a picture. I lifted the photograph from the table and held it out to her. She smiled as she wiped her hands on her apron and came around the side of the table.
Oh my, Michael. It's not a house, it's a mansion,
she exclaimed, as she viewed the picture.
And he willed it to you?
I laughed at her childlike excitement. It would appear so. At least that's what these documents are stating. I gazed back at the paperwork still in my hands and carefully skimmed over the copy of the will.
Where is the house?
She asked, placing the photograph on the table and gathering up a few more plates. I briefly sifted through the 3 sheets of paper that had been included. Uh-oh, here it is. It says the estate is located somewhere in Humboldt County, California.
I've never been to California,
she said, as she left the room to the kitchen. If I'm not mistaken, I believe it's somewhere in the northern portion of the state. I called to her and set the paperwork aside. I lifted the picture for a closer examination. The house, as Rachel had stated earlier, was much more than any of the typical homes that we were used to seeing here in Idaho. It was indeed a mansion of looming magnificence. The Victorian building resembled something out of some unique oil painting. The allure of the captivating exterior with its layer of period adornments, witches' caps, gingerbread railings, and a wraparound turreted porch was something that escaped any form of verbal description and had to be seen for it to be truly appreciated. Upon even closer examination, I was able to distinguish an oceanic coastline in the near distance of the home. Rachel had failed to pick up this observation, as she would have surely commented on the building's proximity to the Pacific Ocean faintly visible in the background. I set the photograph aside momentarily and looked to the documents for any additional information that may have been provided on the house. In a small paragraph, it stated that the 8-bedroom home was constructed in 1893, nearly 60 years ago, and provided a full attic, as well as a full unfinished basement that had been converted into a wine cellar.
So, what are our plans regarding this enormous home that has fallen into your lap?
Rachel asked, as she stepped back into the dining room and was undoing her apron. I looked up from the paperwork and grinned. My suggestion is that first thing tomorrow I contact this Alfred Meyer at his office and make the necessary arrangements for us to pay a visit to this house as soon as possible. Rachel smiled and wrapped her arms about my neck, kissing me for my aspiring recommendation. The following morning, I proceeded to make the necessary arrangements with the legal assistants at the Meyer Law Office in San Francisco to visit the house. I was assured that my prepared arrival to the Balzer estate would be graciously accommodated upon request, and unbeknownst to me, that my coming would be relayed to the sole occupant who still remained within the mansion, my late uncle's servant, whose name was only referred to as Frederick. After consulting Rachel, we agreed we would depart the rail station in Boise on Thursday of the following week and arrive in Sacramento later that day. Upon arrival in the state's capital, the law firm would provide transportation to escort us to the estate approximately 5 hours north of the city. As they had stated, the law firm kept true to their word and had provided us with a large black sedan that patiently awaited us as we stepped from the rail station that afternoon. The driver, a slender young man by the name of Andrew, promptly accepted our luggage as we neared and stored it in the vehicle's trunk. I placed his age somewhere in his mid to late 20s compared to my own 38. The day bestowed upon us a bright, warm afternoon as we traveled north on Interstate 5 from the Sacramento Valley and eventually redirecting to Route 20, which followed up the state's coastline. With the windows partially opened and the warm Pacific breeze caressing our faces, we soon had easily succumbed to a light sleep in the sedan's spacious back seat. Rachel woke me with a slight shake.
"Michael, we're here,"
she said softly, recently awakening from her own slumber. Sitting up straight, I rubbed the fatigue from my eyes and beheld the mansion slowly rising to reveal itself over the remote hills ahead of us as we approached. The warming sun was now beyond its zenith and was making its gradual descent toward the rolling waves of the vast Pacific Ocean just off to our left. Gazing out to my right, I observed the acres of low rolling hills and the peaks of the redwood forests in the far-off distance. Turning off the main road, we proceeded between two large entrance pedestals on either side of the property's driveway. Atop of each high concrete pillar was perched a fierce-looking griffin of stone whose dead stares observed our early evening arrival. "Charming," I remarked as the car passed through and made its way up a gradual ascending slope to the entrance of the looming mansion. The faded image of the house did not do the building the slightest form of visual justice as the sedan pulled up to the magnificent facade of this immense baronial castle. Its fanciful detail heightened the grandeur of the house along with its eclectic turrets and gables, a striking design, leaving Rachel and myself in slack-jawed awe as we exited the car and stood within the expansive shadow cast by the towering mansion.
"It's like something from a movie,"
Rachel muttered as she moved to my side. "I don't believe I could truly admire a sight such as this simply by looking upon a photograph," I said. "One must physically be in the presence to fully appreciate its radiance." While the two of us stood side by side facing the house in an odd hypnotic trance in which the house had easily enchanted us with, Andrew was already moving our cumbersome baggage from the sedan's trunk and hauling it up the stairs of the wraparound porch, where he neatly stacked the luggage to the side of the front door. Once our baggage had been completed, it was the sound of the trunk slamming closed that abruptly pulled our stare from the mansion.
"I was told to give this to you, sir."
Andrew was handing me a manila envelope.
"It's the copies of all the paperwork pertaining to the house, including an additional copy of the will."
As I accepted the envelope, he was cramming his hand into his pant pocket.
"Before I forget, here are the spare set of keys."
He held out a tiny ring with 2 dangling keys. Thanking the young man for his efforts, I generously tipped him and wished him safe travels back to the city. As the sedan rounded in the circular driveway and retreated to the main road, Rachel and I took one last glance at the house, then proceeded up the stairs of the front porch.
"Should we knock?"
she asked, as we stood facing a set of solid dark mahogany doors. The front doors were set with a complex stained glass insert in each face. The right door depicted the image of an angelic female displaying her set of unfurled wings while wielding a sword, as the left displayed the twisted form of some demonic being clutching the familiar barbed pitchfork. Each segmented pane was done in a dazzling exhibit of colored glass that seemed to be enhanced even more vividly in the reflecting rays of the setting sun. "I don't see why we should. The house is now technically ours," I answered with a smile and slipped one of the keys into the lock. The key easily turned within the door, and at the sound of the lock disengaging, I casually pushed them both inward. At the opening of the portals, a slight breeze rushed from the depths of the home and gently stroked our faces as it passed by. The breeze carried with it a peculiar odor of what I could only describe as a distinctive mixture of the home's musty, stagnant interior and a faint trace of some type of fishy malodor. I could almost taste the pungent smell on my tongue and grimaced.
The first thing we need to do is open some windows. The fresh ocean breeze will do the house a world of good,
Rachel stated as she stepped inside. Leaving our baggage on the porch for the time being, I followed her through the threshold. Inside the sprawling interior, I again felt as I had when I stood outside, admiring the home's massive exterior, small and inconsequential. The office said that my uncle's servant was still living here, I said as I stepped further into the foyer and continued to absorb my new surroundings. I ran a finger over the surface of a nearby end table, where a tall decorative vase sat. From the lack of upkeep, I'd say he's probably away on vacation, I said, as I brushed a wad of dust from my fingertips.
This place is like some immense castle, Michael. You can't expect one man to possibly do everything,
Rachel answered back. At that moment, a door opened and closed from some unknown location toward the back of the house, and I could hear the approaching sound of footsteps on the runner carpet in the far hall. As the footfalls drew nearer, I found Rachel now at my side. From the main hall that ran past the elaborately wood-carved staircase in the foyer appeared a tall elderly man in a finely pressed black suit typically worn by servants. The man was slender in appearance. His thinning gray hair was slicked and combed back. His steel blue eyes hid behind a pair of thin wire-framed glasses which sat perched on his nose.
"Good evening,"
he said calmly, bowing slightly at the waist.
"I hope your journey was pleasant. I am Frederick. I served your late uncle before his passing, and now, young Master Balzer, I serve you."
I chuckled at the formal introduction, since greetings had never been presented to me before, and I found it somewhat humorous to have it done to someone as commonplace as myself. I approached Frederick and shook his hand. "A pleasure to meet you, Frederick. I'm Michael, and this is my wife, Rachel." I gestured to her, and she nodded and smiled. "I apologize for not knocking or calling for you."
"This is your home now, young master. There is no need for apologies."
He craned his neck to the side and took notice of our baggage still on the porch.
"Feel free to wander about, sir, and explore the house. Get a lay of the land, as they say, while I bring your bags up to the master bedroom."
Before I could interject and stop the man to let him know there was no need for him to carry our baggage to the upper floors by himself, he was already on the porch gathering what he could manage. The last thing I wanted was my uncle's lone servant, who had toiled over him through the countless years, to perish from a cardiac arrest by carrying our luggage up the steep staircase like some Arctic Sherpa on his first day with us. I turned to relay my concerns to Rachel, but she had left my side and found her way into a spacious sitting room off the main hall. I gave Frederick a second glance before deciding it was probably best if I did not watch his labors, and moved into the sitting room. "Magnificent," I said aloud as my head swiveled on my shoulders and took in as much as I could visually absorb of the luxurious chamber.
Look at this,
Rachel said behind me, and I turned toward her. She was making her way to an enormous stone fireplace at the far wall. She stopped short of the hearth and motioned to what hung over the mantel. A large, flat, rectangular object was fastened to the wall, and I say object because whatever it was covered by a sheet of brown wrapping paper, making its identity unknown. I could only surmise that it was a painting of some sort.
Odd that it's covered. I wonder why.
Your guess is as good as mine. I walked to the fireplace. Perhaps it was a portrait that my uncle wasn't fond of. Rachel held a finger to her lip as if suddenly remembering some forgotten thought, and hurried from the room and back into the main hall. I followed out of curiosity.
I thought I saw that,
she stated as she pointed to another object on the foyer wall. This brown paper-wrapped object was oval-shaped.
They covered another one up.
Frederick had closed the front door as he hauled in the last of the luggage. I held out a hand and lightly touched his shoulder as he passed, briefly stopping him. "Frederick, we noticed that some of the paintings have been covered. Is there a reason for this?" I pointed to the oval hanging.
They are not paintings, sir. They are mirrors.
He turned his gaze from the wrapped mirror and continued up the staircase.
It was your uncle's dying wish that all mirrors in the house stay covered.
"That is an odd request," I said, as we watched Frederick climb the stairs.
Why would someone want all the mirrors covered?
Rachel added. "Perhaps he was a vampire?" I chuckled and put an arm around her. In the days that followed, we thoroughly explored the aged mansion with its numerous rooms and long winding halls. It was still surreal that this magnificent house had fallen unexpectedly into my lap and was now, if I so wished it, my possession. The house was without a reasonable doubt much more than the two of us required, and at times I wondered if it was worth moving from our quaint home in Idaho into a home so immense. It almost seemed to be a shameful waste of living space, as it was just Rachel and I, and of course Frederick. Nevertheless, we kept such thoughts behind us for the time being, as our time here was limited to a few more days, and there was much more to discover of the mansion and its veiled mirrors. One room in particular that I had come across was situated in one of the high turrets facing the coast. The door to this room was locked, and locating the key had become somewhat of a mystery. Even when I inquired to Frederick of the room and its locked door, he simply stated the room was my uncle's private study, and the whereabouts of the key were unknown to him. I found his answer vague and unconvincing, and decided to find my own way into the secured area. I decided for reasons unknown to keep the room's presence from Rachel for the time being, until I was able to enter and see inside for myself. One item that had caught her specific interest was located on the second floor. At the end of the floor's main hall, a very large and covered mirror had been placed. The mirror was nearly as tall as me and just over 3 feet wide. It was as of now the largest mirror we had encountered in the house. I had not been there at that very moment, but the giant mirror had captured her interest with the most anxious curiosity, and she took it upon herself to peel away a portion of the brown paper and glimpse the mirror and its frame. As a woman, it was causing her great dissatisfaction not being able to view herself as she dressed in the morning and set her hair. Thus, the opportunity to gaze into a mirror had grown to an obsessive level. She had torn back a 6-inch section of the paper when Frederick had come upon her and immediately rectified her actions by rushing to the mirror and pushing her hand away. He then quickly taped the torn section of paper back into place and offered her a curt apology before returning to his daily tasks. To say such a rash reaction took her aback was an understatement. I assured her I would speak to Frederick that evening regarding the incident. That night, as Rachel and I sat at the extended oak dining room table finishing our evening meal, I brought the matter up to Frederick as he cleared the table. "Frederick, may I speak to you of a matter that has been brought to my attention?" I suddenly began.
But of course, young master.
He paused at his task and directed his attention to me. "Rachel tells me that you—" I tried to make this sound as tactful as possible. "Interrupted her a tad harshly when she was attempting to view the large mirror on the second floor. What is the true reasoning behind the covering of all the mirrors here?"
As I stated, sir, it was your uncle's dying wish that—
Yes, I realize it was his dying wish," I cut in. "But what is the real purpose behind it? Why?" He stood unmoving for a few seconds, still holding a few plates in his hands until he finally said,
The covering of the mirrors after someone dies is so they do not find their way back."
"Find their way back?" I almost wanted to laugh. "I don't understand." Who's trying to find their way back? Frederick resumed cleaning off the table.
It is of no matter, sir. Some things are best left unexplained.
Rachel glared at me from across the table with a puzzled look. Again, Frederick was attempting to deflect the question with another of his vague answers. Frederick! My voice was raised slightly and took on a stern tone. I'm sorry, but I must insist that you do explain. I realize we are new to this house and that many of my uncle's daily affairs are not known to us, but being that he was my uncle, I again insist that you explain yourself fully. Frederick paused again, his back to me as he was preparing to whisk away the stack of dishes. Slowly, he turned about and carefully set the dishes back on the table. He straightened himself and sighed.
You are correct, sir. He was your relative by blood. My apologies for being so discreet on the matters you speak of. If you are to stay in this house, then it is imperative that you become familiar with your late uncle's affairs.
I exhaled heavily as it was obvious that there was no longer any need to pursue any form of verbal strong-arm tactics, and that Frederick was now willing to bend and relay to us what we wished. Thank you, was all I could say.
Perhaps if the young master would accompany me upstairs, I can explain your uncle's last wishes more appropriately.
I threw a glance at Rachel. She nodded vigorously and forced a thin smile. Removing my napkin from my lap, I stood from the table. I'll be just a moment, dear. Again, she smiled and nodded. I motioned for Frederick to lead the way, and the two of us departed from the dining room. I followed him from the room and into the darkening interior of the mansion. After several familiar turns, I soon realized that he was leading up to the west turret, where the locked room was located. He stopped at the door to the room and turned to me, leisurely pulling an iron key from his breast pocket. I opened my mouth to protest his earlier lie regarding the key's placement, but instead said nothing, allowing him to unlock the door. With the lock unsecured, he gently pushed the door inward, allowing me to enter first. The room was circular. Its walls were of stone and mortar, and the floor was constructed of polished wood planks. Only one window had been positioned in the room across from the door. The arched window was cast in an iron frame and faced the ocean. Set beneath the window, a small table of dark wood was placed. The centerpiece was a heavy open tome nestled in a stand. The book, even from my standpoint, was visibly old and time-worn, its pages beige in color. White, unlit candles surrounded the book like tiny soldiers standing erect and on guard. On either end of the table sat a tall, grotesque statue of something resembling both man and squid. My eyes roamed over the black candelabras lining the walls and the strangely painted symbols on the floor. The same wretched odor that was released from the bowels of the mansion upon our initial arrival lingered even stronger here. I don't understand, I muttered, still on the door's threshold. What is this?
Your uncle's affairs, sir.
I was shaking my head in bewildered confusion, refusing to step into the room. What does this mean? I don't...
The late Mr. Bowser was a master of his craft, sir. His fondness of the old ones who dwelt in the deep was an unquenchable obsession. He spent untold hours locked in this room, studying the ancient tome and conducting its rituals. Encrypting the stars, hoping to reach out to them in their cold depths and satisfying their demanding needs. In the end, he awakened them from their timeless slumber and drew their attention. This was not enough, though. He wanted more. He wanted to share in their vast knowledge of the cosmos and strengthen his own being and mortality.
What happened? Did he achieve what he was seeking? I said softly as I braced myself within the door's threshold and stared out the lone window to the endless sea beyond.
He did. He reached out into the dark, vast unknown void, and they answered his beckoning call. He entered this chamber one evening and never left. It wasn't until 3 days later that I allowed myself in and found he was no more. Only his torn and shredded clothing remained in a pile on the floor. I can only surmise that the great old ones granted him what he implored of them, not realizing the inevitable toll they would exact.
I turned from the room and faced him. And the mirrors? Frederick sighed.
I believe your uncle knew what was to come, and that if he were to succeed, that he should not, for whatever reason, be allowed to return to this house and back into the world of man. Immediately after his demise, I covered the mirrors so that he could not find his way back. They've remained covered ever since.
Why, though? I leaned against the door jamb and tried to absorb all I had just heard, attempting to reconfigure the tale into some type of sensible explanation that would not prove myself mad for believing in its fantastic outcome. Why did he not want to come back? Frederick said nothing, staring at me with an expression of unemotional stone that refused to offer any form of resolution. It was then that a scream erupted from somewhere below us in the house. It was Rachel. Without hesitation, I pushed past Frederick and raced through the narrow halls and down the winding stairs from where the scream had come. It was in the second-floor hall that I found her. My mind was still confoundedly trying to grasp the story that had recently been relayed to me when I witnessed the brain-numbing sight. The large mirror at the hall's end had been stripped away of its paper wrapping, exposing the thick, ornate frame and what should have been a tall pane of reflective glass. Instead, no glass existed. Beyond the mirror's frame was an obsidian abyss filled with an obscured swirling mist. Standing just beyond the mirror facing me was Rachel. For the briefest moment, I wondered why she stood there unmoving and insanely frightened, instead of rushing to me. I then saw why. Reaching out from the abyss were a number of long, slender black arms ending in hands with elongated talons. They gripped her arms and legs. The hands had even gripped handfuls of her dress, attempting to pull her through the frame and into the black world beyond. Her arms were outstretched and her hands clutched at the frame for support as she was slowly being drawn in. Her eyes were bulging wide, and tears streaked her terror-stricken face. She screamed my name. I rapidly took several steps forward down the hall, but faltered when I saw what else was emerging from the swirling mist. Twisted red tentacle-like appendages slipped from the void and were wrapping themselves around her. The glistening tentacles brought the pagan images of the statues from the forbidden room to my mind. She was in mid-scream when a tentacle slithered out and found her head, coiling itself around her face and closed over her mouth and one eye.
Rachel!
I screamed to her and reached out in a futile gesture of a failed rescue. It was then that she was suddenly jerked back with unearthly force, pulling her off the frame and into the abyss, where she was seen no more. I fell to one knee and cried out. Within a matter of minutes, my entire world had been somersaulted into some nightmarish realm of immeasurable proportions. I knew in my very soul that I had lost her forever to some indescribable and horrendous fate. Why did she have to unveil the mirror? Why?
Michael.
A deep, rasping voice called out my name, and I peered up to the mirror. Stepping from the shrouded void was the naked form of a hairless man. The man's flesh was a bloated, pale, bloodless color, and his body oddly misshapen. I squinted my eyes, and in an alarming recognition, realized that it was none other than the late Vernon Balzer. "No," I found myself saying aloud.
Yes, Michael.
It spoke in that rasping, gargled voice.
I have returned to my home.
"No!" I screamed at the abomination as it stepped fully from the mirror and into the hall. I climbed to my feet and watched as it opened its arms in a welcoming embrace and smiled. There was movement beneath his skin, as if unseen living things squirmed about under the pale flesh. His smile revealed toothless gums, and his eyes were without color, like small pallid orbs. His contorted body glistened in droplets as if he had just risen from a body of water.
Your beautiful wife has given herself for my rightful return. She graciously opened the doorway to their detestable world and has shown me the way home.
From his face, small worms sprouted from the very flesh and wiggled about as they grew.
Come and welcome your uncle back, my lad.
I screamed in some incoherent roar and rushed at the vile being. Despite the visual horror I was confronting, the final image of Rachel's terrified face as they pulled her into the mirror fueled me with such rage that it threatened to release its destructive fury onto an object. Vernon's flesh was as cold and slick as it appeared as I grappled with this resurrected monstrosity. He laughed with his toothless maw as we wrestled, my fingers sinking into him as if he possessed no bones. His grip was firm on me as we struggled in the hall, bouncing each other from one wall to the next while trying to maintain our footing. My enraged efforts were of no concern to my opponent as he continued to laugh. At times his face would press close to my own and I could feel the tiny worms caressing and poking at my cheeks. The powerful stench of rotten fish filled my senses. As my strength waned and his continued unwavering, I felt his skin swelling in my grasp and watched as albino-hued tentacles ruptured from his body and entangled my own limbs. He howled in laughter at the fear that welled in me, the flaming anger inside me now dwindling to embers. As we spun once again from one wall, I saw he had taken a step back, drawing him close to the open mirror. I took this opportunity to release the drained reserves of my strength into one last forceful push that sent both our entwined bodies through the frame and into the blackness beyond. I could hear my uncle's laughter quickly turn to wails of misery. The fall into the mirror felt as if I had been plunged into a pool of dark, frigid water. Even the world around me held the experience of being underwater. The slow, restricted movements, the sensation of deep flowing currents brushing over me in my weightless state. Yet there was no lack of oxygen. I could still breathe with no suffocating restrictions. Vernon's struggles were no longer directed at seizing me now, but trying to break free of my clutches and swim to the rectangular window in the pitch-black abyss. Like a shining beacon in the dead of night, the defined shape of the mirror and the waiting hall beyond the illuminated passage back to the world of men. I held tight and tried to wrestle my way ahead of the monster, pushing it down with my feet into the endless depths as I fought to reach the exposed portal. My outstretched fingers were now just a foot away when Frederick appeared in the hall and was rapidly making his way to the mirror. Vernon was now wrapping around my legs like some constricting python as I slowly edged ahead of him to the open mirror. I screamed out Frederick's name, but like being submerged in water, the sound was muffled and deadened. I looked down and saw that Vernon was now more of some repulsive squid than he was man, and tentacles of great lengths were pushing their way from his torso. I turned my gaze to the portal and saw that my fingertips were within a fraction of an inch of piercing the gateway between the two worlds. I screamed out his name again, and it was then that he looked up and gazed into my face. "Pull me through!" I shouted. Instead, the torn brown paper was folded back into place and replaced with newer paper. I screamed again as my surroundings grew darker as the light from the hall was being shut out. The squid was now completely entangling me as it dragged me away from the mirror. Frederick promptly covered the last opening in the mirror, and my world was cast into a cold, impenetrable blackness. I screamed into the void. Algonquin legend says the Wendigo was once a man like you and me. Poisoned by greed and gluttony, the man turned into a pale, gaunt creature with sunken eyes, reaching limbs, and an insatiable hunger for human flesh. Always hungry, the Wendigo searched constantly for its next meal. The truth, however, is much worse. My name is Charles Keeper, and I was an investigative reporter for a local paper in Wisconsin. If that sounds impressive, then you have the completely wrong idea about my career. Mostly they sent me out in the middle of nowhere to investigate supernatural events and creatures. Half of the people I talked to were pulling their bullshit stories out of their ass, and the other half were hopelessly deluded. Not exactly a perfect job, but hey, whatever puts food on the table, right? My last investigation brought me to a small town nestled deep in the northern forests of Wisconsin. So the curious among you do not seek out this town. I will omit its name. Trust me, it's for your own good. In any case, the remote settlement made a small buzz after a young man living with his mother reported 2 grisly murders. One he committed himself, and another he claimed was the work of the Wendigo. The man, who I shall simply call Robert, told authorities he heard a scream while hunting one evening. Following the noise down one game trail, he found his neighbor half-eaten while a skeletal white creature stood over him, covered in blood and gore. Robert shot several rounds into the creature and then burned its body. The body of the Wendigo was later identified as that of a man who had gone missing almost 15 years prior. Robert never stood trial. To get a closer look at the full story, I first met with Robert at his home. I realized it might not be the smartest idea to visit a confessed murderer on his own property. However, I made certain his mother would join us. Even a crazed killer would not hurt an innocent reporter in front of his mother, or so I told myself anyway. Their home was a shack battered and broken by time. Dust fogged the windows and weeds strangled the rickety porch. The front door, where Robert waited eagerly for me, hung at an angle and swung to even the gentlest breeze.
"You're here,"
Robert said. He sounded surprised, but pleasantly so. His lips curled into a wide, yellow-toothed smile, and then faltered, falling into a gloomy frown. We shook hands and headed into the living room to talk. The room smelled of spilled beer and old deli meat. Robert invited me to sit on the couch, no doubt the source of the dizzying stench. I didn't plan on staying long. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," I said. "I know what you went through must have been difficult, so I won't pry too deep. But please, if you would, recount that day for me in as much detail as you're comfortable with. Our readers are eager to hear the truth." Robert shrugged.
"Ain't nothing. People deserve the truth, even if it's hard to hear."
"I couldn't agree more," I said. I forced a smile.
"Truth be told, I'm just happy someone wants to hear my story,"
he said.
"The newspapers, you read them? They make me out as some lunatic killer."
"Well, I work for a newspaper," I said. "But we're dedicated to all sides of the story. That includes your side. So whenever you're ready." I pulled out a notebook and pen. Scratching his head, Robert glanced up and to the side. His brows scrunched together as he struggled to recall his story. Real or fake? I didn't know or care. After some time, Robert shrugged again.
"Nothing special about that day. I went out hunting. There's some game trails back through the woods there. Didn't find nothing, of course, and night came all quick-like, so I was just heading home."
"And that's when you found your neighbor and the, He nodded.
"Wasn't 3 yards from the backyard, if you can believe it. I couldn't. At first, I didn't see nothing. Like I said, night came all quick-like. Clouds all across the sky, so not a moon or star to see. But I heard it."
He made an unsettling sound like a dog gnawing on a bone.
"Then down the path I shine my flashlight. I see it. And Kev."
"Kev is your neighbor?" He nodded. "And the creature?"
"The Wendigo,"
he corrected. "Yes, the Wendigo. What did it look like?"
"It was tall with long white limbs. Its skin was stretched thin as if it didn't fit its bones. And its eyes. They were sunken in, like big black pits. They were cold, dead. Nothing but hunger and hate."
His brow pinched together and his mouth fell open.
"Blood, too. Blood everywhere. On its arms, on its face, on its chest. And there Kev is."
He cleared his throat and muttered something under his breath. I didn't catch it.
"God bless him. He was just torn to shreds. And that beast, the Wendigo, still had bits of him in its teeth. Well, I got my Ruger, and I pumped 5 shots into it. No hesitation."
"You and Kev were close?"
"Good guy. We hunted together on occasions. Ma says he went looking for me in the evening, wanted to ask me something. Now I'll never know what,"
Robert said. He stared into the distance and said nothing. I was beginning to wonder where his mother was. So far she hadn't made an appearance, and the longer the silence lingered, the more uncomfortable I felt. Eventually I made a curt cough. "And the 5 shots, did they kill the creature?"
"Seems so. Howled something awful and fell to the ground. But I don't take no chances. I knew what it was as soon as I saw it, and I know the legends. Only fire can kill a Wendigo. So I ran back home and got some gasoline and lit that fucker up."
His face spread into a proud smile. I said. The police identified the Wendigo as—
Yeah, I know,
Robert interrupted.
but I didn't know him.
You think it was this man or something else? Robert shrugged.
Could be. They say the Wendigo used to be human.
A small shriveled woman shuffled into the living room.
Ain't no human,
She said in a harsh, combative tone.
Ma,
Robert said.
I told you before, Robbie. Wendigo just means evil spirit.
You think it's a spirit? I asked his mother.
I do. You know how many people have gone missing over the past 50 years? 5. Christ, we only have 100 people in this town. Something ain't right with that forest. It ain't natural. You want my advice? Don't go near it.
I chuckled. Funny you should say that. I was just about to ask you if you'd show me where you found the Wendigo.
I can show you where the game trail starts,
Robert said.
but even I won't go down that way again. You're not thinking of looking around, are you?
His eyes twinkled with genuine concern. Robert may have been a murderer, but I could tell he truly believed the story he told me. I pitied him. Well, you already killed the Wendigo. What do I have to fear? I said. The wrinkled old woman scowled.
Don't go looking for trouble, 'cause you'll find it, and you'll be sorry.
A good reporter would follow up on the story with the police. If Robert's mother was right, the town had too many missing persons than could be explained. But I am not a good reporter. I wanted to go home. It didn't matter whether or not I got to the bottom of the story. My readers would still eat the garbage up anyway. So I went out to the woods looking for more Wendigos. One night in the forest, and I'd called the story finished. It's not like I expected to find anything. The forest was a forest. Once you've seen one, you've seen them all. Dead brown leaves blanketed the floor, while reaching black branches blinded the sky. And through the woods ran a winding dirt path where Robert used to hunt. After walking up and down the trail for an hour, a starless, moonless night had cast everything in shadow, so I made camp for the night. I set up a tent and lit a small fire to keep me warm. Once the flames grew tall and bright, I pulled out my notebook. Late in the evening, I heard strange noises, I wrote. Rustling trees, muffled chatter. A shadow shifted among the silhouetted trees. It could have been a person or an animal, but the hair on my neck stood straight up. I didn't feel safe. None of it was true. I hadn't experienced anything outside of the forest's usual sights and sounds. The fire cracked. I sighed. I was tired of spending nights alone in the forest making up stories about fictional creatures. There are much better ways to spend one's time and make one's money. I was still young. Maybe I could switch newspapers and write something real for a change. I heard another crack. Then another. This time they hadn't come from the fire. I squinted into the dark forest. It had to be some kind of animal. All sorts came out at night to forage. Possums, raccoons, skunks, and so on. But as I searched into the woods, I saw the branches bend and snap. The animal was large. A coyote, perhaps. What else could it be? Leaves rustled. The sound was close. Whatever it was approaching the fire. I looked long and hard for the source of the noise. And soon, I saw an inky shadow passing from tree to tree. Robert? I asked the dark figure. Is that you?
There was no answer.
Robert?
Nothing.
Now I was grown afraid. Against all logic, I entertained the possibility that maybe Robert and his mother were right. Maybe there were such things as Wendigos and evil spirits. God, I hoped not. Just in case, I grabbed a log and lit one end in the fire. Robert said only fire could kill a Wendigo. It was probably bullshit, but, better safe than sorry. Before long, the noises stopped. I waited and listened with the flaming log in hand. Minutes passed, one after another, but the forest was silent. After several bated breaths, I relaxed. The campfire, which I had all but forgotten about, had burned down to its last embers. The dark coals smoldered faintly, so I placed my makeshift weapon on top and tried to coax the fire back to life. Just then, I heard the crunch of leaves close behind me. I whirled around, but there was nothing. Only my tent trembling slightly to a cool breeze. I built the fire into a great blaze whose heat and light gave me strength. For hours I watched the flames dance and listened for any noise, big or small. Thankfully I heard nothing, and by the time the fire finally died, I was exhausted but calm. With my fears behind me, I headed into my tent to rest. It was then I saw it for the first time. The Wendigo. Its face, not at all human, was a pallid skull adorned with gnarled black antlers. To fit inside the tent, the towering creature hunched over its limbs, but its body was not pale or emaciated as Robert had described. At one look, it was solid, black flesh with muscles wide and bulging. And at the next, it was a gossamer fog. However, I didn't get to look too long before it knocked me out cold with a swipe to the head. I woke in a dingy cave with a raging headache and a chill running down my spine. I was naked, bound to a rock slab, and utterly terrified. Beside me were two other slabs, each with a pale, naked body on them. Even in the dark, I could see the curve of their bones pressing so tight against their skin, I thought it might burst. They were dead. They had to be. Yet, when I called out for help, the two bodies stirred suddenly as if wakened from sleep.
"You're alive? Oh, thank God,"
I said.
"Where are we? How long have you been here? What's happening?"
For all my questions, I only received anxious grunts and groans in response. The two people craned their necks to look at me. When I saw their faces, I shrieked in horror. They weren't people. Not anymore. Their eyes had receded into their skull, and their teeth had narrowed to beastly points. Bloody sores spotted their hairless scalps, and scars marked their gaunt cheeks. When they looked at me, they gnashed their teeth and licked their tattered lips. I had no doubts Robert had seen one of these creatures. But why were they tied up? And what was the creature I saw in my tent? I didn't know. All three stone slabs faced a long, gaping tunnel that stabbed deep into the hillside, far from the touch of light. I strained to see its end, yet I could see nothing. And as I looked deeper into the tunnel, I saw a white skull and black antlers emerge silently.
Hey! Who are you? What do you want?"
The creature eyed me with a hollow stare and then sank back into the darkness. My heart raced in my chest as I struggled against my restraints, but they would not budge. I felt around for something to help me escape, but the ropes pressed down on my wrists. I could only reach fruitlessly with the tips of my fingers.
No, no, no.
I muttered in a shrill, frantic voice.
No. Please, help me. Help!
My breaths grew short and shallow until my lungs trembled. No matter how hard I gasped, I couldn't get enough air. Soon, my vision spun and went black. When next I woke up, I found my captor seated on a rock. Though it had no eyes to blink, the creature was staring at me.
What do you want?
I asked. It cocked its head to one side but said nothing.
You aren't human. What are you? A ghost? A spirit?
The creature grumbled low in its throat.
A spirit? Is that it?
The creature murmured in a deep guttural voice. Whatever words it spoke, it was no language I had ever heard before.
A demon? A Wendigo or something?
Wendigo, it said in a menacing tone. The Wendigo stood and approached me. It lowered its hand toward my bare chest, and then growled. Then, pulling its hand back, the Wendigo turned and walked towards the next captive. The pale beast on the table was already squirming with anticipation.
What do you want?
I asked again. The creature spoke several words in its foreign tongue.
I don't understand.
Food must starve,
it said as it scanned the captive's willowy body. I had no idea what that meant, but I didn't like the sound of it. I hurled another barrage of questions at the Wendigo, but this time it ignored me. From out of thin air, the Wendigo produced a short steel knife. Without hesitation, he pressed the keen blade against the captive's sickly white skin. The beast wailed in pain as the Wendigo shaved off a sliver of skin. But when the deed was done, the bony creature raised its head. Mouth agape, it stretched toward the slice of flesh like a flower to the sun. Then, chanting, the Wendigo fed its prisoner. In an instant, the meager strip of skin was gone, consumed without second thought. But the chants continued for several moments more, and when they finally ended, the pale beast began to whimper. It shrank in on itself and trembled visibly. Delighting in its fear, the Wendigo chuckled. Then, after a long, disturbingly silent moment, the Wendigo thrust his hands into the beast's stomach. Soon the cave filled with the victim's shrieks of horror and pain, and the Wendigo's moans of pleasure. I closed my eyes, too scared to watch. Several minutes passed before the screams finally died down. I cracked open my eyes. Somehow the pale creature's stomach was untouched. Even so, it continued to writhe on the slab, traumatized and in agony. As for the Wendigo, it had moved on to the next victim. Cruel laughter rumbled low in the cave, accented by the shrill whimpers of the imprisoned. The ritual was about to begin again. I heard the cry of steel and of pain and of pleasure. Organs squished and groaned. Blood sloshed and spilled. All the while, I wondered when it would be my turn to suffer under the Wendigo's touch. However, when the Wendigo finished, It merely turned and disappeared down the tunnel. It was not yet my time. Time, they say, is relative. And in that cave, with no light to signal the day, it could have been days, weeks, or even months that I stayed strapped to that stone. Hunger gnawed at my belly, aching worse than anything I've ever felt before. At times I caught the Wendigo watching me from the shadows as if waiting for something. But he didn't say or do anything. He continued to torture the other prisoners, but not me. After that, he returned to the tunnel and disappeared for hours on end. With the Wendigo gone, I searched for some way to free myself, but I could think of nothing. One day I heard the wind howl from somewhere behind me. Another day I heard rain patter gently against stone. The exit couldn't be too far away, but still too far from reach. In time, the pain of starvation became so unbearable that I could think only of food. I even chewed off the dry flakes of my lips in a desperate attempt to fill my belly. But it didn't even touch my hunger. God, I would have eaten anything if you put it in front of me. Of course, this was exactly what the Wendigo was waiting for. Food must starve, it had said. It didn't take long to figure out what that meant. I had watched the Wendigo enough to know it wasn't torturing the other prisoners. It was feeding off their pain, their starvation, their hunger. When the Wendigo stood before me one day, I knew it was time. I had starved enough. My heart quaked when I felt the Wendigo's short steel blade, but I suffered the pain with pride. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. The Wendigo had not broken me yet, and when my flesh was forced into my mouth, I spit it back out at the cruel spirit. However, the Wendigo didn't care. It hacked off another chunk of meat, grabbed my jaw in a firm grip, and shoved the flesh down my throat. As I swallowed my pride and flesh both, the Wendigo muttered in its demonic tongue. The words meant nothing to me. Even so, I felt a strange sensation seep into my veins as if my achy, unrelenting hunger had expanded out of my stomach and into the rest of my body. While I pondered what was happening to me, the Wendigo forced its hands into my abdomen. Its fingers throbbed as they wrapped around my stomach, twisting it and tearing it open. My entrails surrendered to the Wendigo, bursting under its strong grip. The pain was unimaginable. I roared in agony, while the Wendigo moaned in delight. No man or woman should have to endure what I did. Worse than the pain and the Wendigo's pleasure was the knowledge I could do nothing to stop it. I was helpless. Not just then, but for years. I thought I would grow accustomed to the torture, resign myself to it. But pain is a funny thing. When you feel it intense enough and often enough, you don't grow numb to it. You grow more sensitive. It traumatizes you. Every moment of every day you fear it, scared and helpless. That's what I was for so many years. You may wonder how I survived so long on just meager scraps carved from my body. The Wendigo did something to me and the others. Call it a spell or a curse or whatever you want, but I survived. I survived and I starved, so the Wendigo could feed for years to come. What that creature did, it changed me. Slowly,
almost without notice, I became like the other prisoners. My hair fell out, my eyes sank back into my skull, and my skin drained of all color. Even my thoughts had started to disappear, consumed by an irresistible, insatiable hunger. I could only cling desperately to my humanity. I forced myself to recall my favorite songs, my hobbies, and my family's faces. But it was all fading so fast. Soon, I knew. Soon, there would be nothing. What's more, I heard things. Deep within the lightless tunnel, thin, ghostly voices murmured and growled. I caught only the echo of their words, but it was enough to convince me I had truly gone mad. Regardless, I did escape that cave eventually. That faithful day began not with my freedom, however, but with the freedom of another. Sometime after feeding, when the Wendigo had returned to its tunnel, one of the prisoners rose from its slab. With a jagged rock in hand, it walked to the center of the cave and looked at the path behind me where a soft wind murmured. I could barely believe it. Of course it was possible. After all, Robert had seen and killed one of these creatures. But how many years had I been there? How many years had it been there? If there was hope for that poor beast, then maybe there was hope for me. Maybe it would even let me go. As the pale creature walked past me towards the exit, I opened my mouth to call for its attention. Nothing came out but a dry croak. After all those years without speech, my body barely remembered how to do it. I poured all my strength into my throat and tried again. Please, was all I could muster. It was enough. The creature turned around and approached my slab. Some humanity lingered in the beast after all. It understood me. It pitied me. It would help me. Or so I thought. Still clutching the pointed rock, it looked down at me. For once I could see its eyes clearly. They were utterly black. Its pupils had expanded until they consumed the entire cornea. Inside I could see nothing, no thought, no emotion, only hunger. Mouth ajar, the beast grabbed my arm and lifted the rock. All I could do was scream. Then, appearing suddenly, the Wendigo caught the creature's wrist. Without a word, the Wendigo dragged its prisoner back to the slab. Desperate to escape, the creature thrashed at its captor. It clawed and scraped and bit, though to no avail. The Wendigo took the abuse without complaint. In a last-ditch effort to free itself, the creature grabbed one of the Wendigo's antlers and pulled with all its might. A short, twisted chunk snapped off, making the Wendigo howl in pain. For an instant, the creature was free. However, it only managed to take a step before the Wendigo returned to its senses. With the back of its hand, the Wendigo struck its prisoner across the face. Keen and crooked teeth sprayed across the cave. They tinged against the cold stone like death bells ringing. Fueled by the rage, the Wendigo thrust its hand through the creature's chest. Blood splattered over the prisoner beside me, who licked up the hot liquid without remorse. Now one prisoner short, the Wendigo sighed and muttered something in its ancient tongue. Then it grabbed the bloody corpse and dragged it into the tunnel. Halfway down, before disappearing from sight, the Wendigo stopped
and looked back at me. A shiver ran down my spine. I clutched my fists tightly. In one of them was a tooth that fell like a miracle into my hand. I prayed to any god that would listen not to let that miracle be taken away. And perhaps one of them heard me, because the Wendigo turned around and sank into the darkness. Uncertain how long the Wendigo's absence would last, I waited. The tooth would be my key home, but I had to be smart. As I expected, the Wendigo returned shortly. It would not let a slab sit empty, so it slipped past me into the free world where it would soon find another victim. After several anxious minutes, I began my work. The tooth I received was a molar. It wasn't sharp enough to cut a rope, so I honed it against a stone slab. It took hours to narrow the tooth to a razor-like point, and just as I began to saw through my ropes, I heard the rustle of cloth against the cave floor. It was the Wendigo dragging its prey. This time it was a girl, blonde. In her mid-20s, I guessed. The Wendigo laid her against the slab and disrobed her. She was pretty. At one time, I may have looked at her with pleasure and desire, but at the time, all I could think of was how hungry I was. I held on to the sharpened tooth for another week or so, hiding it when necessary. Truth be told, I was too terrified to free myself. If I got caught, that was it. No more miracles. I would be stuck in that cave forever. I needed a distraction. One day, as the Wendigo carved a sliver of flesh from my thigh, a thin beam of light penetrated our chamber. The light was weak, as if it had come from somewhere far off, but it might have well been the noontime sun. I hadn't seen light in decades. Although the light flickered and slipped away, the sound of footsteps echoed throughout the cave. As soon as it heard the sound, the Wendigo dropped its knife and vanished into its tunnel. What it feared, I couldn't say. Your guess is as good as mine. But it was an opportunity, and I took it. I frantically dug the tooth into my rope binds. Not long after the footsteps, I heard the voices of 3 men calling out for someone. I didn't know the girl's name, but I could only assume they were looking for her. The ray of light flashed our way again, this time wider and stronger. I glanced at the girl. She struggled against her own binds, but to no avail. Her lips moved, but no words came out. Starvation had drained her of all energy. She was helpless, just as I had been so many times before. But not this time. This time I would be free. I hacked through my restraints even as the men's voices faded along with the thin, shifting light. Knees wobbly, I pushed myself to my feet. I gave one last look at the depthless black tunnel and left as quickly as my legs would allow. The whole time I wondered if the Wendigo would drag me back to the slab or kill me as it did the other prisoner. However, luck shone on me that day. After several minutes of raggedy breath and throbbing anxiety, I stumbled through the mouth of the cave into freedom. For a man that had not seen light in years, the moon and stars were blinding. And though I shielded my eyes from them, their presence gave me hope and comfort. Gaunt and naked, I ran through the woods in search of civilization. At some point, I collapsed from exhaustion. But when I woke again, I returned to running, bound by fear and hunger. It was midday when I found the dirt path that wove between the trees. I followed it until I came into contact with a young man on a hike. Naturally, his first response was to scream. "Ah! Please, I said. It was the one word I knew I could say, and this time the hiker responded with kindness and concern. Despite the horrific transformation I had undergone, he could still tell I was a person. Not just that, I was starving and covered in cuts and scars. "I'm sorry," the man said. "Do you need help? How can I help you?" I took a step closer. The man's cheeks were full and red with life, and along his neck ran a plump, juicy vein. I tried to speak, but this time only a hoarse grumble came out. "Water? Do you need water?" the man asked. He pulled out a plastic bottle from the bag strapped to his back. "Food," I said. I took another step closer. My heart roared in my ears. Or perhaps it was his heart I heard, beating strong behind his thick, meaty chest. A shiver ran down my spine. The man pulled a granola bar out of his backpack. "Here," he said. I reached forward to take it, but I didn't want granola, and I couldn't control myself. I tried, I swear I did, yet even with the Wendigo far behind me, his influence lingered. I swatted away the granola bar and leapt at the man, scratching him across his neck. Blood coated my nails, and when I licked the dark drops, they tasted sweet as cream. Unbeknownst to me, the man had a knife. He stabbed it into my shoulder and then cut me across the cheek. The pain was no worse than what I had felt every day in that cave, but I didn't want to suffer anymore. I let go of the man and retreated into a fetal position. Meanwhile, the man ran. To the cops, I presume, because sooner or later a group of police officers approached me, with guns drawn. Not long after, I found myself in a cell, imprisoned again. At least this time I was clothed and fed. Of course, the police had questions, simple ones. For instance, "Who are you?" It took me a second, but I remembered. Charles. Charles Keeper. They ran the name through their database. Then they came back with a photo. It was a photo of me. I looked so different, I barely recognized myself. Yet it was enough for the cops.
Jesus Christ,
one of them said.
"You've been missing for 15 years.
15, I repeated. It felt like 50.
What happened to you?"
they asked. Their eyes studied me closer, never once letting up or looking away. I cowered into my knees. I said nothing. When the silence dragged on too long, they held up another photo.
"Do you know this girl?"
It was the girl from the cave. I flinched at the sight of her.
"You do, don't you?"
I looked up. It hurt to meet their gaze, but I met it anyway. "Please," I said. I didn't want to think about her. I didn't want to think about the Wendigo. "Please don't. I can't."
"Can't what?"
one cop asked. By the color of his face and the volume of his voice, I could tell he was angry.
"She's been missing a week. Her parents are worried sick. They want to know what happened to their baby, and you can't tell us?"
You won't. You won't," I stuttered.
"We won't believe you?"
Another cop finished. I nodded.
"Go on. Try us."
If you tell us where she is, maybe we'll forget about the man you assaulted in the forest."
Another cop added. I had no choice. They wouldn't let me leave until I told them, so I did. I told them everything. At times I caught them looking among each other, thinking no doubt I had gone mad, but on the whole they were receptive. Maybe the Wendigo was just a man in a costume. Maybe the trauma of my torture had altered my memories. In any case, 2 of the cops happened to be part of a search party that investigated the cave the night I escaped. Even if my story was a lie, it didn't matter so long as they found their missing girl in that cave. They asked me to help them find her. There were simply too many tunnels in the cave for them to find her on their own, but I refused outright. Nothing would bring me back to that cave. The thought of it triggered such a severe panic attack that they let me go without another word. Since then, I've readjusted to life, as best I can anyway. At first, food tasted sour, but for the most part, I've gotten used to it. I just take my steaks rare now. I found myself a lady, too. She's decent and sweet, and she helps me forget about the times I've suffered. She doesn't believe my story. I can sense it in the tone of her voice whenever the subject comes up, but she knows better than to tease me. As for the missing girl, the police never told me if they found her. I haven't heard anything from them since they released me. I hope they did find her. I really do. But in the many years that have passed, it never once occurred to me to find out. To tell you the truth, this is the one story I don't want to see to the end.
Well, that's pretty much the most horrible thing I've ever seen. It was the only thing I could think to say as I stood over the body of one of Bill Morton's calves. Bill stood behind me, nodding his head in utter agreement. He snorted hard and spit into the field before hiking up his pants. Apparently, this was the 3rd calf he had lost in as many weeks. Aliens. His gruff voice hit my ears, and it didn't instantly register what he had just said. Aliens? I repeated, looking away from the horrid state of the calf. Yeah, you know, aliens. His eyes were dead serious, so I avoided the smirk that was threatening to develop on my face. I saw a documentary about the kind of stuff they do to cows on YouTube. Nasty stuff. I knelt next to the animal. The grass was soaked in blood that was already drying in the summer heat. I could see puncture marks dotted on its side that seemed to go in a straight line. Blood matted the fur in little circles around each wound. The calf's head looked as if it had been ripped apart, and most of the brain was missing. Also gone were the calf's tongue and eyes. No, Bill, I guess more likely this is an animal attack. I looked over all the wounds again and scratched my stubble. No offense to your keen detective skills, Deputy, but what kind of animal does that? He got down next to me and pointed to the torn-apart skull. I can't rightly say, Bill, and I truly couldn't. I figured that an animal attack was far more likely than an alien cattle mutilation, but I'll be damned if I couldn't tell it all from the state of the calf. I'd seen my share of coyote attacks, and even a few mountain lions. When you work as a sheriff's deputy in a ranch town, those calls are common. This didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. Course you can't, Frank, 'cause it's aliens. I'm telling you. He got back up with a wheeze and wiped the sweat from his brow.
Them government boys in that facility outside of town. Ask them. I'm sure they know all about it.
The facility off the highway? I got up with them, shifting my gun belt and straightening my uniform as it did so. It's the Department of Agriculture, Bill. I don't think they're going to know much about aliens.
Sure they don't. And I don't know much about whiskey and Johnny Cash tunes.
He paused for a moment and snorted again.
I know a lot about those things.
I got that, I responded, the smirk finally breaking through on my face enough to elicit an annoyed reaction from old Bill. I decided to smooth things over with an offer. We'll round up with fish and game to see if we can get some people out here to help us hunt down your calf killer. In the meantime, how about I stop by after work and we beat the bushes ourselves? See if we can't solve this issue a bit sooner. Bill's eyes scanned the thicket before he nodded.
All right, Deputy, but I'm telling you, I don't think we're going to find nothing unless we look to the skies.
He slipped his thumbs into his belt and looked up at the midday sky. I laughed to myself and clapped Bill on the shoulder. I was still taking it all with some measure of calm, back when I thought the worst it could be was some rogue wolf or mountain lion. I didn't know at the time what we would find stalking around that thicket and in the trees, and if I had, I may have just grabbed the gas can from my patrol vehicle and set the whole damn place ablaze.
Bill thinks it's what?
Terry laughed and looked at me with wide-eyed surprise. Terry was a fellow deputy and longtime friend. He had offered to help me and Bill look for the predator that was going after any of Bill's calves that wandered too close to the thicket. We had loaded up my truck with a couple of lever-action 30-30 rifles and some extra ammo. No bullshit. The guy thinks it's aliens. I took the turn onto the road that led to Bill's property.
Bill is fucking out there, man. Dude's a riot.
Terry paused and let out a contemplative
Though I gotta say, the way you describe it, I can't exactly tell you what we're looking for.
Well, I wish I could give you a better clue, but I'm just as stumped as you. The truck's headlights illuminated the front of Bill's ranch, and I slowed to a stop.
Big cat would have drug it off. Coyotes would have ate its guts, same as a wolf. Ain't no bears around here. And I'm pretty sure they don't kill like that.
He undid his seatbelt and shook his head like he was trying to jostle the answer loose.
Shit, maybe it is aliens,
he said with a laugh.
It's not fucking aliens.
I chuckled back as I jumped out of the truck.
Don't you be too sure, Deputy.
I heard Bill's gruff voice boom out of the darkness as he walked from the side of his house to greet us. He was wearing his hunting oranges and carrying a 12-gauge. A headlamp was strapped to his balding head. His old retriever Bootsy walked at his heel.
Even a dumb cowpuncher like me is smart enough to understand there's stuff out there beyond our understanding.
Oh, of that I'm sure.
Terry pulled one of the 30-30s out of the back of the truck and threw it over his shoulder.
The universe is a big place, boys.
Bill looked up at the night sky, either ignoring or oblivious to Terry's joke.
No telling what's out there.
Well, Bill, I pulled the other 30-30 from the back of the truck and started loading it. Right now, I'm a bit more concerned with what's out in that thicket than what's hiding among the stars.
Fair enough.
Bill did his trademark snort, then spit in the dirt. He switched on the headlamp and shouldered his shotgun.
Y'all ready?
Bootsy, clearly noticing his master was ready to go, ran up ahead towards the field and looked back at us. He did a quick run in a circle, as if to tell us to hurry the hell up.
Let's go bag us a...
Terry paused and looked at both Bill and I with a shrug.
Fucking alien, I guess.
Terry and I laughed, and Bill grunted as we walked across the field towards the thicket, Bootsy leading the way. We walked to the edge of the thicket, shining our flashlights while looking to see if we could catch signs of anything stalking around the underbrush. Bootsy ran back and forth, sniffing at the edge of the bushes and occasionally stopping to piss and let whatever was inside know that he had been there.
So what did the Fish and Game say?
Bill whispered to me as he dropped down with a huff and investigated an opening between the tall bushes. They transferred me around a bunch. Hell, by the end, I'm not sure I was talking to someone at the Fish and Game. When they finally got me talking to the person they wanted me talking to, he said they'd be sending someone out right away. I thought I saw something shift behind the brush and looked in further. My voice got even quieter, but I finished my thought. Decided it was still better to just come out and look around ourselves tonight. You know the government. Right away could mean a few weeks. Oh, I'm sure they'll send someone out sooner than that. Bill got back to his feet and adjusted the lamp on his head. They don't want to give us too much time poking around out here. I'm sure you're quite right, Bill. I laughed again and looked further up the thicket to see Terry standing extremely close to the thick bushes. At first I thought he was looking at something, but I noticed his flashlight was down by his side. Bootsy came sprinting up past me at blinding speed and ran towards Terry while barking his head off. I started running towards Terry as well, with Bill jogging his best shortly behind me. As Terry came closer into view, I could see the look on his face. His eyes were wide with terror, and his lips were pulled back into an awful grimace. He looked as if he wanted nothing more than to scream, but for some reason it was frozen in the back of his throat and choking him. His arms were at his sides, one hand holding the flashlight and the other balled into a tight fist. The 30-30 was still slung over his shoulder, and the question as to why he hadn't pulled it flashed through my mind before I noticed exactly why. His arms were pinned to his side by something that my mind couldn't even start to process. At first, I thought they were giant leaves or branches. Their dark green color matched the surrounding thicket almost perfectly. There were two of them at least 4 feet long that had wrapped around Terry's body in what looked like an uninvited embrace. What in the fucking hell? I stopped dead in my tracks, startled as the things wrapped around Terry suddenly squeezed tighter and an audible hiss filled the air.
Don't get any closer,
Terry shouted, his voice in utter panic. Bootsy barked around his feet now, and the hiss in the air got louder. Tears streaked his face as he tried to turn his head to look in my direction.
Oh, God, man. Please get this dog away from me. It doesn't like the dog.
Bootsy, heel! I heard Bill's voice behind me, somehow firm but shaky at the same time. He drew in a deep breath. Bootsy continued barking wildly at whatever had a hold of Terry. I realized what was holding Terry so firmly were massive chitinous appendages like insect legs. I stood in utter shock, my eyes just barely making out the massive shape hiding in the darkness of the tall, thick shrubbery. The thing squeezed him tighter, and I could see blood streaking down his arms.
Oh, God, please, fucking help me.
Terry's voice was laced with such a horrible terror it woke me from my trance. I raised my rifle to my shoulder and tried to find an angle to take a shot where I wasn't going to risk putting a bullet in my friend.
Bootsy, heel now!
Bill shouted again, taking a step to the side of me but not daring to get any closer to Terry.
Bootsy!
The hiss filled the air again. Bill continued yelling for his dog.
Heel now!
Terry screamed his head off. The thing in the bushes hissed and chittered. Through all this, I took aim at a shadow I could barely see and pulled the trigger. The sound of the gun echoed through the night sky like thunder. I had missed, the bullet striking nothing but branches and whizzing past the thing as it yanked Terry forward into the thicket. I could hear his screams as it dragged him along through the underbrush. The whole thing happened so goddamn fast, I didn't even notice Bootsy leap through the hole made by Terry's body and give chase. I gripped my rifle and followed closely behind the retriever. Bill followed as close as he was capable of. The branches scraped and cut at my skin as I ran. It was pulling Terry so quickly that even Bootsy was having trouble keeping up.
What in the name of Johnny's ghost is that thing?
Bill growled out from behind me, a wheeze both preceding and following his question. I didn't answer. I didn't know. I just ran and listened to my friend scream. His screams were getting further away from me, and I wondered how in the name of God it could move so damned fast. Then suddenly the scream stopped, and my heart jumped into my throat. Bootsy had vanished somewhere into the darkness in front of me. He was still barking at the thing that took Terry, but they echoed throughout the thicket, and I couldn't tell exactly where they were coming from. We had run far enough in that trees were sprouting up from the ground around us, and it felt like I was in a maze and making myself increasingly lost with every second.
We got to go back, Frank. We got to call someone,
Bill shouted.
I'm telling you, that thing ain't no normal animal. It ain't from around here. Would you shut the fuck up about your stupid goddamn alien bullshit?
I turned on my heel and screamed at him before turning my flashlight back towards the brush in front of me. I didn't see any signs of Terry or the thing that had taken him. Somewhere off in the distance, Bootsy's barks turned into high-pitched whimpering yelps, overlaid over the top of that horrid hissing sound that it made. Then Bootsy was silent too. I looked at Bill's face, his eyes filling with tears at what was likely the sound of his dog's last moments. The night had become deathly quiet in only a matter of seconds. The air was still and warm against my bleeding skin as my ears hunted for any sound of movement around us.
Bill,
I whispered, reaching out to him slowly and putting my hand on his shoulder. We need to go. We need to go now. Bill silently gripped his shotgun with white knuckles. When his eyes drifted to me, he seemed a million miles away. Bill, I said, a little louder and firmer. Did you hear me, man? We got to go. There was more hissing followed by what sounded like chirps and clicks. From behind Bill, I could see something rise out of the brush, wreathed in shadow. It stood at least 6 feet tall as it straightened up. 2 huge insectoid claws protruded from the front of its body. They were bent forward at the halfway point, and the creature held them in front of it, as if it were in prayer. No fucking way, I thought to myself. As Bill turned on his heel at the presence he sensed behind him, his headlamp illuminated the massive green insect and brought it into full view. Its diamond-shaped head held 2 bulbous eyes that looked directly at us, and 2 antennae that had to measure at least 2 feet in length. Mandibles flicked up and down at the point of its jaw, making a clicking noise. It lowered the posture of its long body, the rest of its legs bending to bring it closer to our level as it let out a horrible hiss. Bill shrieked and raised his 12-gauge to fire, but what I now could see was a massive mantis, impossible as that may seem, lurched forward and dug the spines of its forelegs into him, causing the shot to go wild. I raised my gun, but by the time it was leveled at the creature, it had already lowered its head to Bill and begun digging its mandibles into his skull. Bill's screams were so loud that I could still hear them as I pulled the trigger on the .30-30 and fired. The bullet struck the side of its face, and even in the low light, I saw one of its eyes explode. I half expected it to drop, but Bill's screams continued, and instead of falling, the mantis just squeezed Bill even tighter with its forelegs and drug him backwards, away from me at a surprising speed. I let off 2 more rounds, but its thin body was hiding in the brush, and it was waving Bill around like a human shield. It was like the goddamn thing understood. It vanished into the darkness, and Bill's screams went silent shortly thereafter. That horrible chewing sound is still something I can hear when I close my eyes. In that moment, knowing that my friends had been eaten by these things, my mind shattered. I ran down the path we had made on our way through the thicket as fast as my legs could move me. I didn't bother to look back. I didn't want to see what was following me. I could hear more clicks and see more moving shadows all around me as I ran. With every single branch that scraped me, I wondered if it was the claw of one of those fucking things getting ready to drag me off and devour me alive. I could hear the hissing, but also the hum of engines and the sight of lights out in the field. Overhead, I heard the thrumming of a helicopter passing over us. I burst through the thicket and into the previously empty field, now filled to the brim with black SUVs, and men in hazmat suits setting up lights. A man who looked like a park ranger came running up to me and screaming for another group behind him to hold their fire. I was in complete shock and hadn't even noticed a group of men leveling AR-15s in my direction. As soon as the man touched my arm, I blacked out. I woke up in a blindingly white room. I could hear the hustle of people running around outside, and as I surveyed my surroundings, I realized I was inside a tent. I attempted to get up from the cot I had been laid on, but a hand gently touched my shoulder, and I heard a woman's voice.
"Easy now. Just take it easy."
I blinked a few times, trying to get my eyes adjusted to the light. A woman in a lab coat moved around in front of me as I got into a sitting position and rubbed my face with my hands. "Where the hell am I?" I dropped my hands and looked to the woman who was now leaning on a shaky fold-up table with laptops and paperwork scattered across it. She had a shock of red hair pulled up high and held in place by pencils. Her glasses sat low on her nose. She looked to a soldier that was positioned behind her and nodded, a gesture he returned before stepping out of the tent.
"Your name is Franklin Beaumont? You are..."
She scanned the clipboard in her hand.
"You are a sheriff's deputy in this area?"
"Yeah," I answered quietly, looking around the room at machinery I didn't understand. "Who are you?"
"I'm Dr. McDonald. Karen McDonald. I'm Dr. Karen."
She extended a hand that was as awkward as her reply, and I reached out and shook it.
"And you are still on site?"
"Sight?" I asked, not having any idea what she was talking about.
"About 100 yards from where you collapsed."
She looked down at her clipboard again.
"It was probably just shock. You've been through a terribly traumatic experience, Mr. Beaumont. Do you remember?"
It all flooded back. Terry and Bill, Bootsy, the mantis that had torn them apart. I fought back tears and nearly bit a hole into my lip. Dr. Karen simply stared at me with inquisitive green eyes and scribbled something further on her stupid clipboard. "Of course I remember," I finally said. "Those fucking things killed them."
Wolves. Wolves, Mr. Beaumont.
A man in a blue suit walked into the room. His hair was slicked back, and he wore a practiced smile.
Not things. You've been through a major trauma, and we just want to make sure you're not misremembering things.
"I'm remembering just fine," I gruffly spoke to the man as he walked around to the same side of the folding table as Dr. Karen. 2 soldiers with AR-15s followed closely behind him. He stood in front of me with his arms crossed, waiting for me to continue. What I saw was not a fucking wolf.
Of course it was, Mr. Beaumont. What else would it have been?
He looked at Dr. Karen and she shrugged. I saw instantly what was going on as the 2 soldiers behind the man in the blue suit looked nervous.
I don't know.
I hung my head, suddenly very uncomfortable and scared. The mantis obviously had some connection to whoever these people were, and they were not playing around. Mr. Blue Suit and Dr. Karen were the handshake and the smile. The men behind them were the much tougher form of negotiation.
We are deeply sorry about your friends. Know that we at the U.S. Department of Agriculture give you our word that we will take care of this pack of wolves and ensure that no one will ever be hurt by them again.
The man in the blue suit grabbed the binder off the table and held it out in his hand. Department of Agriculture. I laughed into my hands. You guys are from the fucking Department of Agriculture? I laughed again and looked at the soldiers with their guns and black night ops uniforms.
Yes, Mr. Beaumont.
The blue suit man pushed the binder into my hands.
Who else would we be?
I spent the rest of the night signing papers saying that my friends and I had tracked the wolves to the thicket where we had been attacked. I was to decline any interviews on the subject, and if pressed, I was to toe the line on the official story. I can still remember the plastic smile on the face of the man in the blue suit. He gave artificial condolences as they sent me on my way. Dr. Karen gave more genuine ones, but they rang hollow. That night, I drank a fifth of bourbon alone in my apartment and cried myself to sleep. There was never any direct threat made against me to keep my mouth shut. They made the cars that followed me and the men parked outside my home noticeable enough that they never needed to make any kind of direct threat. I could only imagine what government agency the blue suit man was actually from, but I knew when there was a gun to my temple, and I doubted very seriously that the Department of Agriculture was holding it. That's why I'm sharing this story here and leaving out the details. I can't keep it inside anymore, and if I go anywhere official, then I'm a dead man. I know what I saw out there, though, and it sure as hell wasn't wolves. Our government grew something. I don't know if it escaped or if they let it loose on their own, but they are most certainly responsible. I drive out toward Bill's old ranch sometimes, and I can see the lights of whatever makeshift area they still have set up out there. The whole thing is surrounded with a massive fence now. Signs hang on it every 30 feet. No trespassing, by order of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Bill didn't have any family, so it was easy for them to swoop in and take the place for themselves without some nosy relatives wondering what happened to them or why the government was stealing their land. I'll stand out by that fence sometimes and smoke cigarettes and listen. I'll listen to their trucks driving in and out from the drive and the hustle of men doing whatever those men do out there now. I'll also hear that hiss, that awful hiss. But sometimes I wonder if that's just all in my head. All I know for sure is that there were no wolves out there that night. But there is most certainly something stalking the thicket on Bill Morton's old property. Something that isn't choosy about its prey.